It was a quiet Saturday morning when David Johnson pulled his car into the driveway of his suburban home. The neighborhood was still, with the gentle hum of sprinklers and the occasional bark of a dog breaking the silence. For David, mornings like this represented peace. After years of hard work, late nights at the office, sacrifices made and battles fought both, professionally and personally, he had finally secured a home he could be proud of. The garage attached to the house had always been his sanctuary, a space he kept meticulously organized, a place where his tools were aligned with precision and his car rested like a prized possession. It wasn't just storage, it was his territory, his symbol of independence, and his reminder that he belonged here. But on this morning, something felt off. As he approached, David's brow furrowed. The garage door had been left open overnight, unusual for him, given his careful nature. Inside, to his disbelief, was a silver SUV that did not belong to him. Parked brazenly right in the middle of his garage was a vehicle he had never seen before. For a moment, David stood frozen, trying to process what he was seeing. His first thought was that maybe a friend or neighbor had needed emergency parking. But that possibility faded quickly when he noticed the familiar emblem of the Homeowners Association on the dashboard, a laminated badge used by HOA officials when conducting inspections or business. His jaw tightened. Just as he began to step inside, a voice carried across the driveway. "Oh, good morning." The words were syrupy, forced, and laced with entitlement. It was Karen, one of the HOA board members, known throughout the community for her complaints, her self-assumed authority, and her uncanny ability to make Black residents feel as though they were unwelcome guests in their own homes. David turned slowly. "Good morning. Why is your car in my garage?" His voice was calm, measured, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of disbelief. Karen waved her hand dismissively, as though the question were trivial. "Oh, don't worry about it. I had some errands to run this morning and didn't want to leave my car on the street. You have such a nice, big garage. I figured it wouldn't hurt for me to use it for a little while. Besides, this is community property in a way. We all need to share spaces." The audacity struck David like a slap. Community property? His garage was part of his deed, his mortgage, his sacrifices. The thought that someone could casually occupy his space, uninvited, and then brush it off as if he should accept it, stirred something deep inside him. He inhaled slowly, refusing to let anger dictate his response. "Karen, this is not community property. This is my home, my garage. You can't just park your car here. Down." "Well, technically, the HOA oversees property regulations. I'm on the board, so I'm allowed to make certain decisions for the good of the community. You're new here, so maybe you don't fully understand how things work." David's chest tightened. He had been in this neighborhood for nearly a year. He had worked tirelessly to fit in, to greet his neighbors with warmth, to host small gatherings, to contribute. And yet to Karen, he was still new, still someone who didn't belong, still someone who needed to be reminded of invisible lines. "Karen," he said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers, "move your car. Now." But Karen crossed her arms, planting herself in the driveway as if daring him to push further. "You don't need to get upset. Honestly, I think you should be grateful I trust you enough to park here. Some people in this community would prefer to keep their garages closed at all times, if you know what I mean, but I figured you wouldn't mind. Don't make this into a bigger issue than it is." The implication hung in the air, thick with condescension. David knew exactly what she meant. This wasn't just about a car in his garage. It was about the unspoken assumption that he should accept what was given, that he should bend to the will of authority, that his ownership of this home and the space within it was somehow conditional. For a moment, David considered letting it slide, just to avoid confrontation. But a memory rose unbidden, his father's words, spoken years ago when David was just a boy. "Never let anyone make you feel small in your own house. Respect is not something you beg for, it's something you claim." With those words echoing in his mind, David straightened his shoulders. He walked calmly past Karen into the garage and pressed the button that lowered the heavy door. The mechanical hum filled the air, and Karen's voice rose in protest. "Wait, what are you doing?" The door thudded shut, sealing her car inside. David turned back to her, his face composed. "I'm doing what I should have done the moment I saw your car. You chose to park in my garage without permission. Now your car is locked in my garage until you decide to respect my property." Her face flushed, caught between outrage and disbelief. "You can't do that." "This is illegal!" No, David replied evenly. What's illegal is trespassing. What you did? I could call the police right now and report it, but I won't, if you simply agree never to step over this line again. For the first time, Karen faltered. The confidence in her voice cracked as she realized the tables had turned. She wasn't the one holding power anymore, David was. And the symbolism wasn't lost on him. By closing that garage door, he had done more than lock away her car. He had locked away the entitlement, the presumption, the quiet tyranny she tried to impose. But as he stood there watching her fumble for words, David knew this wasn't just about her SUV, it was about every time he'd been told to tone it down in meetings, every time a neighbor had mistaken him for a worker rather than a homeowner, every time he had been subtly reminded that his place in this neighborhood was still in question. Karen finally found her voice, though weaker than before. I'll call the HOA president about this. You'll regret it. David stepped closer, his tone calm but edged with steel. Call whoever you want. But remember this, I pay my dues just like everyone else. I live here just like everyone else, and I will not be disrespected in my own home. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned sharply and walked away, her footsteps echoing against the pavement. David remained standing in the driveway, heart pounding, but also strangely light. For the first time since moving here, he felt the true weight of ownership, not just of his house, but of his dignity. Inside the garage, the silver SUV sat in silence, a symbol of boundaries crossed and reclaimed, and David knew this was far from over. The following day, David received a call that he had anticipated but still dreaded. It was the HOA president, a man named Carl Green, who spoke with the calm, practiced tone of someone who had wielded authority for far too long. David, this is Carl Green, president of the HOA, he said, his voice smooth but firm. I'm sure you're aware that there's been some trouble with one of our board members, Karen Miller, and her car being locked inside your garage. I've spoken with her and she seems quite upset. I understand you're within your rights, but we do need to discuss this further. Can we meet today? David's grip on the phone tightened. It was what he'd feared. The system was already working against him, bending to accommodate Karen's sense of entitlement. But he would not back down. I'll meet with you, David said, his voice resolute. But I want it clear that I don't owe anyone an explanation for what happened. I simply want to be treated with respect in my own home. I don't appreciate being told what to do by someone who doesn't respect my boundaries. There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a slow, calculating response. We'll discuss everything when we meet. How does 3 p.m. sound? David agreed, hanging up with the feeling of impending conflict weighing heavily on him. He knew this was no ordinary confrontation. This was a matter of principle. It wasn't just about one woman parking her car in his garage. It was about the ongoing racial tensions, the subtle discrimination, and the quiet injustices that many Black residents like him had faced in neighborhoods just like this one. At 3 p.m., David arrived at the HOA office, a small, beige building tucked away behind rows of pristine lawns and freshly painted fences. The interior was bland, full of potted plants and old, laminated flyers detailing the latest neighborhood events. It smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a sterile, unwelcoming environment that only served to reinforce the invisible barriers in place. Carl Green was seated at the head of a polished table. Karen Miller sat beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face still flushed with indignation. She looked at David as though he were an intruder in a place where he didn't belong. David, Carl began, his voice measured, we're here to settle this matter amicably. I understand your position, but Karen did have a valid reason for parking in your garage. She's an important member of the HOA, and she was simply doing what she thought was best for the community. David felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice calm. I don't care about her title or her position. I care about respect. I asked her to move her car, and she refused. I didn't lock her vehicle in as a petty act. I did it because she was trespassing. That's not negotiable, Karen scoffed, leaning forward. You're overreacting. I'm just trying to help make this neighborhood a better place. You're blowing this out of proportion. David took a deep breath. He had expected this. Karen's attempt to downplay the situation, her effort to paint herself as a martyr. He had seen this before in other spaces, when people in power tried to twist the narrative. Here's the thing, David said, his eyes meeting Carl's now. This is not about a single incident. This is about the way Black people are often made to feel small, unwelcome, and invisible in spaces that should be ours just as much as anyone else's. And frankly, Karen's behavior was the last straw. This isn't about her parking in my garage, it's about her assuming that she could make decisions for me, make assumptions about my space, my boundaries. She has no right to do that. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Carl raised a hand, signaling her to hold her tongue. He looked at David, his expression unreadable. "I understand that you're upset," Carl said slowly, "but we have to be reasonable here. The HOA has certain standards, and we can't allow personal conflicts to disrupt the harmony of the neighborhood. What Karen did was an error in judgment, but—" "No," David cut in, his voice firm. "This is bigger than that. It's about power. It's about how people like Karen, people in positions of authority, try to control others. What she did was a manifestation of that power dynamic, and the fact that I'm black only adds another layer to this. You see, she didn't just park in my garage. She parked there because she assumed I would let her, that I would be passive, that I would play along. She thought she could push me around because, in her mind, I'm still the other." The room went silent. For the first time since this conversation began, Karen didn't have an immediate rebuttal. She sat back in her chair, arms still crossed, but now her face was less assured, less defiant. Carl took a long breath. "I see what you're saying, but we still need to come to a resolution." David met his gaze, not backing down. "I've already made my resolution clear. Karen can come to my house, apologize, and move her car. Then we can put this behind us. But I won't tolerate this kind of behavior again, not from her or anyone else. I won't allow my home to be a space where I have to shrink or ask for permission to exist." Carl seemed to digest David's words for a moment, looking between him and Karen. The tension in the room was palpable, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, Carl nodded. "I think you're right. We'll have Karen reach out to you directly and apologize. And moving forward, we'll make sure that all HOA members understand the importance of respecting personal boundaries. No one should feel disrespected in their own home." David didn't smile, but he felt a small sense of vindication. He had stood his ground. He had spoken truth to power. And though the system wasn't perfect, it had heard him. Later that evening, Karen did send an email. It was short, formal, and not quite sincere, but it was an apology nonetheless. David read it, then deleted it. He didn't need her apology to feel validated. What he needed, what he had earned, was his dignity. The next morning, David stood on his porch, the sun rising over his quiet street. The world outside was calm again, but something had shifted inside him. He knew that this small battle was part of a larger struggle, one that Black people had fought for centuries, fighting to be seen, heard, and respected in spaces where they were so often overlooked. As he looked out at the community that he now knew would never truly be free of its biases, David smiled, not with relief, but with pride. He had taken a stand, and sometimes that was enough to start a revolution, even in a quiet neighborhood. Days turned into weeks, and though the initial tension of the confrontation with Karen and the HOA seemed to fade, the ripple effects of David's actions were far from over. In the following days, the neighborhood began to speak in hushed tones. There were no direct confrontations, no loud exchanges, but the whispers could be heard at grocery stores, in the local coffee shop, and even at the gym where David worked out. It wasn't that people were speaking about him directly. Rather, they were talking about the incident involving Karen. Some were sympathetic, others less so. But what was clear was that David had managed to shake something loose in the community, something that had long been buried beneath the surface. The unspoken power dynamics, the quiet racism, the microaggressions, and the sense of entitlement that some felt over spaces and people had all been stirred up by his firm stance. At first, David was unsure how to process it. He hadn't set out to be a hero, nor did he want to be. He simply wanted to live in peace, in the home he had worked so hard to obtain, without being reminded that, to some, he was still an outsider. But now, as he saw people look at him differently, some with respect, others with suspicion, he began to feel the weight of what he had done. It was one evening, as David sat alone on his back porch, that he received an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang, breaking the solitude of his evening. When he opened it, standing there was Lena, his next-door neighbor. She was a middle-aged woman, a widow who had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades. He had exchanged pleasantries with her before, but their conversations had never gone much deeper than a quick hello or an exchange of pleasantries. But now there she stood, her face solemn, almost apologetic. "David, may I come in?" Lena asked, her voice gentle. David stepped aside, allowing her to enter. He had no idea what this visit might be about. Was she here to lecture him? To make him feel guilty for his actions? He had prepared himself for anything, but what happened next caught him by surprise. Lena sat down across from him, her eyes downcast for a moment before meeting his gaze. I've been living in this neighborhood for a long time, she began slowly, her voice tinged with sadness. And I've seen how things work around here. I've seen how people like Karen, people with power, think they can just walk over others. But I've also seen how people like you, people who stand up, get crushed by it all. I've been silent for a long time, David, because I didn't think there was any point in speaking out. But when I heard what happened between you and Karen, I felt something shift. I've seen how the community has reacted, some with support, some with judgment. But I see you, and I see the way you've handled this, and I just wanted to say, David was stunned. He had never expected Lena to speak this way. He had never expected someone in the neighborhood to acknowledge what had happened in such a deeply personal way. I didn't do it for gratitude, he replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Someone had to say something. Someone had to stand up to the way things have always been. Lena nodded, her expression softening. I know, and that's why I wanted to talk to you. Because it's not just about Karen or the HOA. It's about all of us. David, it's about the way we've all been conditioned to accept the way things are. The way we let small injustices slide because we don't want to rock the boat. But what you did wasn't just about parking in a garage. It was about making a stand for what's right, for what's fair. And that's something I think more people need to understand. David let her words sink in, the weight of them settling over him. He hadn't realized how much of an impact his simple act of resistance had truly had. It wasn't just about one person or one moment. It was a catalyst, a spark that had ignited something in others, something that had been dormant for far too long. I don't want to be a symbol, David said quietly. I just want to live my life. I want to be treated with respect. Lena smiled softly. I understand. But sometimes when you stand up, you don't have a choice in how others see you. What you did gave people hope. Hope that maybe things can change. Maybe we can stop letting people like Karen run things the way they always have. You've started a conversation, David. A conversation that needed to happen. David's heart swelled with a mix of pride and exhaustion. It was a strange feeling to be seen, truly seen, for the first time by someone who had been in the community for so long. He realized that while his fight with Karen had been personal, it had touched something universal. It was a fight for dignity, for respect, and for the right to define one's own space in the world. Lena's visit didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, other neighbors came forward, not in large groups, but in small, quiet moments. Some offered their support. Others shared their own stories of being overlooked or dismissed. A few even apologized for their silence, for not stepping in when they knew things weren't right. David didn't need their apologies, but it was clear that his actions had sparked a change in the way some people saw their own complacency lie. The months that followed were a testament to David's quiet yet undeniable influence in the neighborhood. What had started as a single act of defiance in the face of disrespect had blossomed into a movement of awareness, not just within his community but even beyond its borders. David hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked to be a leader or a symbol of resistance. But what he had done, whether he realized it or not, had planted a seed of change that many were eager to nurture. The neighborhood, once a place of unspoken rules and hidden biases, began to shift. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but the subtle, slow evolution was undeniable. People who had once been silent in the face of injustice began to speak up. They started having conversations not just with David, but with one another, about what had been overlooked, what had been ignored. People began to question why some residents had felt so entitled to occupy space that didn't belong to them, why it was acceptable to trample on others' dignity with impunity. Lena was one of the first to change. She became more outspoken in HOA meetings, not just in support of David, but in support of all residents who had been quietly marginalized. She even helped organize a small neighborhood event aimed at addressing the systemic racism that still lingered beneath the surface. While it wasn't a large-scale protest, it was a beginning. The event, which included talks on racial equity, neighborhood inclusion, and understanding implicit bias, was the first of its kind. The HOA, in response to growing pressure from the community, began to make some notable changes. They appointed a committee dedicated to improving community relations and diversity, something that had long been overlooked in favor of ensuring that the neighborhood's manicured lawns remained pristine. The first meeting of this new committee was held in the same room where David had once faced down Karen and Carl. This time, David didn't have to do the speaking. He sat quietly in the back, surrounded by neighbors who had come to support the change. Karen Miller was there too. She had been moved off the board after the fallout from the incident. Though her presence at the meeting seemed to be a formality, no one was looking to her for answers anymore. No one was asking her to explain the way things had been. The power had shifted, and the room felt different, lighter somehow, like the weight of years of unspoken rules had been lifted just a little. Carl Green, too, had shown signs of growth. In his own way, he had come to understand that being in a position of power meant listening, truly listening, rather than simply maintaining control. His previous dismissive attitude had transformed into one of cooperation. He now championed David's voice within the HOA, making sure that issues of inclusivity, respect, and fairness were at the forefront of every discussion. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. The tension still existed. There were still residents who resisted the change, who clung to old ways of thinking, but the fact that they were forced to confront their beliefs, to defend them, was progress in itself. The neighborhood wasn't the only one paying attention. The local news had caught wind of the story, covering David's initial confrontation with Karen and the subsequent shifts in the community. The piece wasn't sensationalized. It didn't overstate the drama or paint David as an outspoken hero. Instead, it focused on the subtle power of small, everyday acts of resistance. David had initially shied away from the attention, but over time, he came to realize that his story had the potential to inspire others. It wasn't about him. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless, overlooked, or dismissed. And as the local news broadcasted his story, he began to receive messages from people in other communities, people who had faced similar struggles, who had felt trapped in their own fight for respect and recognition. Some were Black, like him. Others were from marginalized groups of all kinds. They reached out, sharing their own stories, thanking him for showing them that they didn't have to accept things the way they were. In one particular message, a woman named Mariah from a neighboring city wrote, "I've been fighting for my space in my community for years. Your story made me realize that I can't keep letting people walk over me. I can't keep staying silent. Thank you for showing me how to stand up, even when I feel like I'm alone." David stared at the message for a long time, letting it sink in. He didn't know Mariah, but in that moment, he realized that his fight had become more than just a personal battle. It had become a beacon for others, a reminder that no one was truly alone in their struggle. For the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of peace. He wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something that could help change the very fabric of his community. But change is never linear, and the road ahead remained uncertain. Despite the positive strides, there were still difficult moments. Karen, though removed from the HOA board, was not without influence. She continued to spread rumors about David's radical behavior, warning other residents that his actions had threatened the peace of the neighborhood. Some neighbors still echoed her sentiments, subtly distancing themselves from him, wary of his newfound spotlight. David understood this. It was part of the process. In every battle for equality, there are always those who resist change, who cling to the status quo because it's what they know, because it benefits them. But what kept him going was knowing that for every person who resisted, there were 10 more who supported, who understood. As summer turned into fall, David received an invitation to speak at a larger community forum. The event was hosted by a nonprofit that had been following his story closely. It would bring together leaders from all over the city, activists, educators, business owners, and local government officials, to discuss how small communities could foster inclusivity and respect in ways that didn't feel forced or divisive. It was a conversation David had always hoped for, but never imagined would come so soon. When the day of the event arrived, David stood in front of the audience, a room full of people who had traveled from different walks of life to hear his story. The nerves he had felt in the past were gone. Now, he stood with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that his words carried weight. His story was no longer just his, it had become the story of countless others. "My experience with the HOA," David began, "wasn't just about a single moment. It wasn't just about Karen parking in my garage. It was about a system that had been designed to make people like me feel invisible, to make us feel like we didn't belong in certain spaces. like our presence was somehow an inconvenience. But the truth is, our presence, black people's presence, should never be an inconvenience. We belong just as much as anyone else. And we deserve to have our space, our dignity, our respect. His words resonated deeply with the crowd, and as he spoke, David realized that this was the change he had been seeking. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been made to feel less than. His fight had never been about reclaiming a parking space, it had been about reclaiming dignity. And in that moment, surrounded by people who understood, he felt as though he had done just that. In the years that followed, David continued to live in the same neighborhood. The HOA, the community, and even the world around him had changed. And though there would always be work to do, always more, battles to fight, he was no longer alone. His voice, though quiet at first, had become part of the larger chorus of those who refused to be silenced. David wasn't a hero, but in the story of his small, defiant act of standing up for himself, he had become something far more powerful, a reminder that when we claim our space, when we demand respect, we set the stage for others to do the same, and together we change the world. Winter came to the neighborhood with a stillness that seemed almost symbolic. Snow covered the lawns in white, smoothing out the differences between homes, fences, and driveways. It was a reminder that beneath all the lines people drew, ownership, race, power, there were deeper truths that connected everyone. For David Johnson, this winter marked a full year since the morning he found Karen's SUV parked in his garage. A single act of defiance had altered not only his life, but the rhythm of an entire community. On a crisp January morning, David sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee and reflecting on the whirlwind of the past 12 months. His story had traveled farther than he could have ever imagined. The local news segment had led to interviews in regional papers. From there, it spread online, sparking conversations in forums, podcasts, and community circles across the country. Messages still poured into his inbox from people who had been inspired by his stand. But with recognition also came responsibility. People wanted guidance. They wanted him to speak, to mentor, to show them how to push back against the quiet injustices in their own neighborhoods. David was humbled, but he also carried the weight of knowing that his actions were now bigger than him. He didn't see himself as a leader. He saw himself as a man who had been pushed too far. Yet here he was, being asked to lead. And slowly, with a kind of reluctant grace, he began to accept that role. One Saturday afternoon, David hosted a small gathering at his home. The living room, once just a private sanctuary, now buzzed with voices from across the city. Activists, pastors, teachers, and neighbors crowded together, sharing food, laughter, and stories of their struggles. Some spoke of housing discrimination, others of workplace bias. Some were younger voices, just starting their journeys, while others carried decades of scars from battles fought long before. At one point, Lena stood and raised her glass. "To David," she said, her voice strong, "for reminding us all that dignity is not negotiable, for showing us that sometimes standing up in the smallest of ways can ripple out into something far greater." The room erupted in applause, but David shook his head modestly. "This isn't about me," he said once the noise subsided. "It's about all of us. It's about the fact that for too long, people have been told to keep quiet, to avoid conflict, to accept disrespect in order to keep the peace. But peace built on silence isn't peace at all, it's control. Real peace only comes when there's fairness, when there's respect. That's what we're fighting for. That's what we all deserve." The gathering marked the beginning of something new. What started as a simple neighborhood conflict grew into a coalition of people determined to confront inequities head-on. They called themselves Voices of Belonging. They didn't have grand offices or flashy budgets, but they had conviction. They organized workshops, created resources for homeowners facing discrimination, and built networks of support across communities. David never sought the spotlight, but he became the steady anchor for the group. He shared his story not as a tale of personal triumph, but as an example of what happens when one person refuses to yield. His humility only drew people closer. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself continued to change. Karen Miller, though quieter than before, still lived a few blocks away. She avoided David whenever possible, her pride still smarting from the public loss of control. But over time, even her influence diminished. She was no longer seen as the voice of authority. She was seen as a cautionary tale of entitlement unchecked. Parents whispered to their children, "Don't be a Karen." And though the phrase carried humor, it also carried truth. Carl Green, the once detached HOA president, had become one of David's unlikely allies. Though cautious at first, Carl grew to respect David deeply. He began reaching out for advice before making decisions, involving more residents in the process than ever before. For the first time, the HOA felt less like an exclusive club and more like a community forum. One spring evening, as the days began to grow longer again, David was invited to speak at a local university. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and members of the community. Standing at the podium, David looked out at the crowd and felt a wave of humility wash over him. "I want you to understand something," he began, his voice steady. "When Karen parked her car in my garage, it wasn't just about space. It was about history. It was about all the times people like me have been told that our space doesn't matter, that our presence is negotiable, that our dignity can be pushed aside for someone else's comfort. But dignity isn't something you loan out. It isn't something you let someone borrow. It is yours and it is sacred. When I closed that garage door, I wasn't just locking her car inside, I was locking out the entitlement that said I had to accept less than respect." The room was silent, hanging on every word. David continued, "And here's what I want you to know. Each of you will face your own moment, your own test. Maybe it won't be someone parking in your garage. Maybe it will be something smaller or maybe something much bigger. But in that moment, you'll have a choice, to stay silent or to stand. And when you stand, you don't just stand for yourself. You stand for everyone who's ever been told to shrink." When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Students approached him afterward, eager to share their own stories, their own determination to claim their dignity. As David walked back to his car that night, he thought about his father's words from so long ago. "Never let anyone make you feel small in your own house." He smiled softly to himself. His father had been right. But what he hadn't realized back then was that house didn't just mean the walls around him. It meant every space he walked into, every room, every neighborhood, every community. Wherever he stood, he was home, and he had every right to stand tall. Years later, people would still talk about that winter morning when Karen parked in David's garage. They would talk about how one man's refusal to be disrespected sparked conversations that spread beyond the neighborhood, beyond the city, and into places David would never personally see. The story lived on, not as gossip, not as neighborhood drama, but as a parable of dignity, a reminder that power doesn't always rest in titles, or money, or positions on a board. Sometimes true power rests in the quiet, unwavering resolve of an ordinary man who simply refuses to be treated as less than. And that, perhaps, was David's greatest legacy. Not the speeches he gave, not the recognition he received, but the countless people who heard his story and decided, in their own lives, to close their own metaphorical garage doors, to claim their space, to hold on to their dignity, because dignity, once claimed, can never be taken away. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of memory, but some stories never fade. For David Johnson, the incident that began with a car in his garage had long since passed, yet its echoes lingered in ways he could never have predicted. It had been more than a decade since that winter morning, and life had carried him forward. He had grown older, his hair tinged with silver, his steps a little slower, but his presence remained steady, commanding respect wherever he went. The neighborhood itself had changed dramatically. New families had moved in, young children rode bicycles where David's son once had, and the old HOA had been transformed into something more inclusive, transparent and collaborative. The phrase community meeting no longer carried a weight of dread or tension, but instead suggested dialogue and shared purpose. Karen Miller was long gone, having moved away quietly after years of waning influence. Few people even remembered her name. For those who did, she was not remembered as the victim of a feud, but as the cautionary figure who underestimated the strength of another's dignity. David, however, was remembered differently. His story became part of the neighborhood's fabric, passed down not as gossip, but as history. Parents told their children about the man who stood his ground with quiet courage, reminding them that respect was something no one should compromise. Young people, especially black youth, often knocked on David's door just to sit with him, to hear him tell the story in his own words. For them, it wasn't just about a garage. It was about knowing that they too could hold space, that their presence mattered. One summer afternoon, David sat on his porch as a group of teenagers gathered around him. They were from the local high school, working on a community project about neighborhood history. One of the students, a tall boy named Jamal, leaned forward eagerly. "Mr. Johnson," he asked, "why didn't you just let it go? Wouldn't it have been easier?" David smiled gently, looking out at the tree-lined street before answering. Easier, yes, he said. But easier isn't always right. Letting it go would have told her and everyone, watching, that it was okay to disrespect me, to disrespect this home I worked for. And once you let someone take your dignity piece by piece, you'll find one day you've got nothing left. I didn't want to be that man. I didn't want to teach my son that lesson. So I stood, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The students scribbled in their notebooks, their faces serious as though they understood. They were hearing more than just a story, they were receiving a lesson for life. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of memory, but some stories never fade. For David Johnson, the incident that began with a car in his garage had long since passed, yet its echoes lingered in ways he could never have predicted. It had been more than a decade since that winter morning, and life had carried him forward. He had grown older, his hair tinged with silver, his steps a little slower, but his presence remained steady, commanding respect wherever he went. The neighborhood itself had changed dramatically. New families had moved in, young children rode bicycles where David's son once had, and the old HOA had been transformed into something more inclusive, transparent and collaborative. The phrase community meeting no longer carried a weight of dread or tension, but instead suggested dialogue and shared purpose. Karen Miller was long gone, having moved away quietly after years of waning influence. Few people even remembered her name. For those who did, she was not remembered as the victim of a feud, but as the cautionary figure who underestimated the strength of another's dignity. David, however, was remembered differently. His story became part of the neighborhood's fabric, passed down not as gossip, but as history. Parents told their children about the man who stood his ground with quiet courage, reminding them that respect was something no one should compromise. Young people, especially black youth, often knocked on David's door just to sit with him, to hear him tell the story in his own words. For them, it wasn't just about a garage. It was about knowing that they too could hold space, that their presence mattered. One summer afternoon, David sat on his porch as a group of teenagers gathered around him. They were from the local high school, working on a community project about neighborhood history. One of the students, a tall boy named Jamal, leaned forward eagerly. "Mr. Johnson," he asked, "why didn't you just let it go? Wouldn't it have been easier?" David smiled gently, looking out at the tree-lined street before answering. Easier, yes, he said. But easier isn't always right. Letting it go would have told her and everyone, watching, that it was okay to disrespect me, to disrespect this home I worked for. And once you let someone take your dignity piece by piece, you'll find one day you've got nothing left. I didn't want to be that man. I didn't want to teach my son that lesson. So I stood, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The students scribbled in their notebooks, their faces serious as though they understood. They were hearing more than just a story, they were receiving a lesson for life. Over time, David's words and example began to ripple even further. The group Voices of Belonging, which had started in his living room, grew into a respected citywide network. They held conferences, published guides on housing equity, and even influenced local legislation. David never sought the credit, but everyone knew his stand had planted the seed. He became a figure of quiet reverence, not a politician or celebrity, but something rarer, a community elder whose wisdom came not from theory, but from lived experience. In his later years, David was invited to speak at a museum exhibit dedicated to local stories of resilience. As he walked through the halls, he saw photographs of people who had marched, protested, and fought for justice in countless ways. And there, in one corner, was a display with a simple headline, "The Garage Door That Closed." A chapter of silence. It featured a photograph of his old garage, the one that had been the center of so much conflict. Beneath it was a short description of the incident, emphasizing not the pettiness of the dispute but the dignity of resistance. David stood there for a long while, his hand resting lightly on the plaque. He thought about how strange it was that such a small act had become something larger than himself. Sometimes history doesn't come roaring, he whispered to himself. Sometimes it comes with the quiet click of a lock. That evening, as he sat with Lena, who had been by his side through every chapter, he reflected on the journey. "You know," he said softly, "when I closed that garage door, I thought I was just protecting my space. But it turns out I was protecting something far bigger." Lena smiled knowingly. "You were protecting all of us. That's why it mattered." In his final years, David often returned to that thought. He knew his life had been ordinary in many ways. He was no national hero, no historical figure etched into textbooks. But he also knew that sometimes the most profound legacies are not written in bold headlines, but in the everyday choices that ripple outward. His choice had shown others that dignity was non-negotiable. That legacy was enough. When David eventually passed away, the community gathered in numbers so great that the church overflowed into the street. People spoke not of his accomplishments, but of his integrity, his humility, and the way he made others feel seen. Jamal, now a grown man, stood at the podium and recalled sitting on David's porch years ago. He taught me that standing your ground isn't about pride, it's about principle. And because of him, I walk taller every day. The neighborhood, once defined by tension and silent divisions, now carried forward David's example. A mural was painted on the side of the community center, showing an image of a garage door half open with light pouring out. Beneath it were the words, "Respect lives here." And so David's story became more than memory. It became a living symbol, woven into the culture of his community and beyond. Generations later, children who had never known him still heard his story in classrooms, still saw his name on that mural, still felt the strength of the lesson he left behind. That is the power of dignity. It outlives us. It speaks long after we are gone. And the man who once locked a car in his garage unknowingly unlocked a truth for everyone. That dignity is the foundation of justice, and when one person protects it, they protect it for us all. Years after David Johnson's passing, his story continued to ripple outward like waves on water, touching lives far beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood where it all began. What had once been a local dispute, whispered about among neighbors and HOA members, had transformed into something much greater, a narrative that embodied resistance, dignity, and the quiet power of ordinary people standing tall in the face of disrespect. It was now the younger generation carrying the torch, many of whom had grown up hearing the story of the garage door. Jamal, the boy who once sat on David's porch notebook in hand, had become a teacher. In his classroom, he often reminded his students of what he had learned from David, that small acts of courage could shape entire communities. One afternoon, when a student asked him why the mural at the community center showed a garage with light spilling through, Jamal smiled and told them about the man who refused to let someone else shrink his space. His voice carried pride, not only because of David's stand, but because he now understood what it meant to live that lesson daily. Elsewhere, Voices of Belonging, the grassroots organization, birthed in David's living room, had grown into a statewide coalition. They held annual conferences, produced documentaries, and trained community leaders in conflict resolution and equity practices. Their guiding principle was simple: dignity first. David's name was often invoked at these gatherings, not with fanfare but with reverence. He had become a symbol not because he sought it, but because his quiet defiance had resonated universally. Even outside of the Black community, David's story struck a chord. People of different backgrounds saw in him a mirror for their own experiences, moments when they had been disrespected, overlooked, or dismissed. His act reminded them that boundaries matter, that self-respect is not arrogance but survival. What made his story powerful wasn't just the racial context, though that was undeniably important. It was the universal truth that human dignity cannot be borrowed, stolen, or parked upon. Years later, a documentary filmmaker produced a feature titled The Garage Door, One Man's Stand for Dignity. It traced David's life, from his childhood memories of his father's lessons to the moment that defined his legacy, and finally to the movement that grew from it. The film premiered at a regional festival, where Lena, now much older but still radiant, sat in the front row. Tears streamed down her face as she watched her late husband's life unfold on screen. When the film ended, the audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for the story, but for the truth it carried. At the panel afterward, Lena spoke softly into the microphone. David didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a man who wanted respect in his own home. But I think that's what makes his story matter. Because each of us has a home, whether it's a house, a neighborhood, or even our own body, and each of us deserves to protect it. Her words struck the room like a chord, reverberating into silence before applause filled the air again. The story even reached international ears. Activists abroad cited David's example in discussions about human rights, using it as a metaphor for boundaries in societies plagued by exploitation. The garage door became a symbol in unexpected places: protest signs, social media posts, even classroom discussions in countries far from where David once lived. Back in his old neighborhood, the garage itself had become something of a landmark, Though his home was sold after his passing, the new owners understood its significance. They allowed the community to preserve the space as a small memorial, adding a plaque near the driveway. In this garage, a man reminded the world that dignity is sacred. Every year on the anniversary of the incident, neighbors gathered at the spot. It wasn't a formal ceremony, more like a tradition born of respect. Families brought flowers, children chalked messages of hope on the driveway, and elders shared memories of David's warmth and wisdom. It was less about mourning and more about celebrating the courage that had uplifted them all. One summer evening, Jamal brought his own young son to the gathering. As they stood before the plaque, his boy asked, "Daddy, why do people care so much about a garage?" Jamal knelt down, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "It's not just about a garage," he said. "It's about a man who said no when someone tried to make him feel small. It's about remembering that we all have a right to stand tall no matter who we are. That's why we care." The boy nodded slowly as though storing the lesson in his heart. And in that moment, the legacy continued, passing like a torch from one generation to the next. Decades later, long after most who knew David personally were gone, the story still lived. Scholars wrote about it in books exploring modern civil rights struggles. Artists painted murals, inspired by the image of the garage door, closing against entitlement. Writers turned it into parables and essays about community strength. And in living rooms across the country, people still told the story to their children, not because it was about a man they had met, but because it carried a truth everyone needed to know. David's name might not have been etched in monuments of stone or carved into the pages of official history, but in many ways, his story reached farther than monuments ever could. It lived in people's choices, in the way they insisted on fairness, in the way they refused to bow to disrespect. In the end, David Johnson's life taught a simple but powerful truth, that greatness isn't always loud, dramatic, or earth-shattering. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is the sound of a garage door closing with finality. Sometimes it is the silence of a man refusing to yield. And sometimes that silence echoes louder than any shout, reminding the world that dignity is not negotiable. And so the story of HOA Karen faded into the shadows of memory, but the story of David Johnson endured, etched not into stone but into hearts. Long after the SUV was gone, long after the neighborhood changed, long after the man himself passed on, his legacy of courage, dignity, and justice lived on, because once dignity is claimed, it becomes eternal. Time moved forward, yet David Johnson's story never dimmed. What had begun as a confrontation over a single act of disrespect, the arrogance of a neighbor who felt entitled to his space, had grown into a parable for generations. His stand against HOA Karen was no longer spoken of as gossip or neighborhood drama. It had transformed into something timeless, a reminder of what it means to live with dignity in a world that often tries to strip it away. By the 50th anniversary of the garage door incident, the neighborhood where it all began looked almost unrecognizable. The modest homes had been renovated. Trees that were saplings in David's time now stood tall and majestic, and the once feared HOA had long since been replaced by a community council that functioned with openness and fairness. Yet despite the changes, one house still carried a weight greater than bricks and wood. David's old home, lovingly maintained by the community, had been turned into a cultural heritage site, the Johnson House of Dignity. Inside, visitors could walk through carefully preserved rooms that told the story of David's life. His kitchen table stood just as it had when he hosted the first gathering of voices of belonging. Photographs of his family lined the walls, alongside letters from people across the world who had been inspired by his courage. The garage itself was the centerpiece. Its door had been restored to its original state, and every visitor paused before it in silence, reflecting on the symbolic act that had changed so much. That year, the city hosted a commemoration event. Thousands gathered. Not just locals, but people who had traveled from across the country. Elders who had once lived in the neighborhood sat side by side with children who knew the story, only from books. The mural of the garage, with its light spilling out into the darkness, towered over the square where the crowd gathered. At the ceremony, Jamal, now an old man himself, with his son and grandchildren beside him, stood at the podium. His voice cracked with age, but his words carried the same weight that David's once had. 50 years ago, a man in this very neighborhood made a choice. He didn't march with thousands. He didn't shout into microphones. He didn't hold office or wield power. He simply closed a door and in doing so, he opened one for all of us. He taught us that dignity is not about size or status. It's about standing when others expect you to shrink. It's about saying, I belong here, even when someone tries to tell you otherwise. The crowd erupted in applause, many with tears in their eyes. Jamal's voice grew steadier as he continued. David Johnson is no longer here, but his spirit is. It lives in every one of us who insists on respect, who refuses to let anyone take our place, our pride, our humanity. That's why we gather, not to remember conflict, but to honor courage. As the sun set, a group of children released lanterns into the evening sky. Each lantern carried a single word written on its side. Respect, belonging, justice, dignity. The lanterns floated upward, glowing softly as they drifted into the horizon. The crowd stood in reverent silence, watching them disappear, knowing they symbolized the torch David had unknowingly passed to them all. Over the years, the story of the garage door was taught in classrooms as part of local history, but it also found its way into national curriculums. Educators used it to show how everyday actions could spark extraordinary change. Plays were written about it, poems inspired by it, even songs that carried the rhythm of its message. The simplicity of the act made it universal. Anyone, anywhere, could understand the weight of closing a door against injustice. Globally, the legacy expanded in ways David himself could never have imagined. Social justice movements abroad invoked his story as a metaphor for resisting exploitation. In one country, protesters painted garage doors on walls to symbolize communities closing themselves off to corruption. In another, activists carried small keychains shaped like miniature garage doors, a quiet nod to the man who had turned an ordinary boundary into a statement of principle. What made David's legacy endure was its humility. He had not sought fame or recognition, but because he had stood firmly in a small, personal moment, people could see themselves in him. His ordinariness became his strength. Everyone who heard the story could ask, what would I do if it were me? And many answered by finding courage they didn't know they had. Back at the Johnson House of Dignity, a quote was etched into the wall near the entrance. It was something David had once said in a quiet moment. Recorded by Lena, respect is the foundation. Without it, every wall cracks, every door breaks. But with it, even the smallest house can stand like a fortress. Visitors stopped at that wall, reading the words aloud, feeling the resonance across time. For David's descendants, the legacy was personal as well as public. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren often spoke of the responsibility they carried, not to live in his shadow, but to live in his light. They understood that his story was not just about race, not just about a neighborhood feud, but about something universal, the sacredness of human dignity. And so, as decades passed into centuries, David Johnson's act remained alive, not as folklore, not as exaggeration, but as a living truth woven into the cultural memory of countless people. When future generations faced moments of disrespect, exploitation, or injustice, they often recalled a simple image, a man closing a garage door, reclaiming his space and refusing to let anyone define his worth. The world would continue to change. New challenges would arise, new struggles for justice would unfold. But the essence of David's lesson remained eternal. Never let anyone make you feel small in your own house. And as long as people remembered that truth, his story would never die. Because sometimes history is not made by grand gestures. Sometimes it is made in the quiet strength of ordinary people refusing to yield. And in that quiet strength, entire generations find the courage to stand tall. Centuries passed, and the details of David Johnson's life blurred into history. His neighborhood transformed. His city grew into something unrecognizable, and the world itself shifted through revolutions, technologies, and upheavals. Yet the story of the garage door endured. What began as a neighborhood dispute had become myth, retold so many times across generations that it carried the weight of legend. By the 300th anniversary, David Johnson was no longer just remembered as a man, he was remembered as a symbol. Schools across the continent included him in their curriculum, not merely as a figure of Black history, but as part of the human story. In textbooks, illustrations depicted him standing tall at the threshold of his garage, hand resting on the door, eyes steady with resolve. Children whispered his name with the same awe they reserved for great leaders, though the beauty of his story was that he had been ordinary. In a world that had long since digitized its archives, the plaque at the Johnson House of Dignity was replicated in virtual museums and holographic classrooms. Students across the globe could step into a simulation of David's garage, hearing the creak of the door as it slid shut, feeling the quiet defiance in the air. For many, it was their first lesson in dignity, experienced not as a lecture, but as an immersion into the very moment when an ordinary man said enough. The story had taken on new dimensions over time. Poets turned it into verses about boundaries and belonging. Philosophers cited it when teaching ethics, using David's refusal as an example of moral courage. Activists wove it into speeches about justice, reminding crowds that history often pivots not on grand battles, but on the unshakable choices of individuals. Some retellings blurred the facts, as oral traditions often do. In some versions, David was said to have locked dozens of cars in his garage, though records showed it had only been one. In others, Karen was painted as more sinister than she had been, her arrogance exaggerated into cruelty. Yet through all the retellings, the essence never changed. A man's dignity had been tested, and he had protected it. One evening in a futuristic city where towering glass structures replaced the old brick homes of David's era, a group of children gathered at a community center named after him. The center's entrance was adorned with a holographic mural of a garage door that shimmered with light. Inside, a young teacher spoke to the children. "Who was David Johnson?" she asked, her voice warm. A little girl raised her hand eagerly. "He was the man who closed the garage door," she said. "And why did he close it?" the teacher prompted. "Because no one has the right to take your space," the girl replied, her tone serious beyond her years. The teacher nodded. "Exactly. David Johnson taught us that dignity is not negotiable. He lived in a time when many people were told to stay quiet, to accept less than respect. But he showed the world that even a small act like locking a door can echo across centuries. That is why we honor him." The children listened intently, their eyes reflecting the holographic glow. Though they lived in a future far removed from David's reality, they carried his lesson forward as if it were their own. Meanwhile, beyond education and community life, David's story had entered the realm of culture and spirituality. In some communities, the closing of the garage door became a metaphor used in prayers and meditations. People whispered it when setting personal boundaries, when reminding themselves of their worth, when rejecting disrespect. The phrase, "close the door," carried a weight of empowerment known across languages and cultures. Artists continued to reinterpret the story in every medium imaginable. Sculptors carved doors from stone, standing as monuments in public squares. Writers reimagined David's moment as the climax of epic dramas. Musicians composed symphonies that rose and fell like the sound of a door creaking shut. Each generation found a way to make the story their own, yet the heart of it remained unchanged. And through all this, one truth grew clearer. David Johnson's life was not remembered because of the scale of his action, but because of its honesty. He had stood when silence would have been easier. He had refused when yielding would have been safer. He had claimed dignity not just for himself, but for everyone who came after. In a quiet corner of the world, centuries after his time, a writer reflected on his story in an essay. "The lesson of David Johnson is this," the writer penned. "Human dignity is the oldest right we have. Kings cannot give it, and laws cannot take it away. It exists within us, waiting for the moment when we must protect it." Johnson showed us that sometimes history turns not on swords or speeches, but on the quiet strength of closing a door. And so the myth continued. Some saw David as a hero, some as a prophet of dignity, some simply as a neighbor who became legend. But to all, he was proof that even ordinary lives carry the power to reshape the world. Because when David Johnson closed his garage door, he opened one in history, one that has never closed since. 1,000 years after David Johnson closed the garage door, no one lived who had ever seen him with their own eyes. His home had long since been rebuilt, his city reshaped, his nation reimagined. The world had endured wars, climate shifts, and revolutions of technology that turned reality itself into something David would never have recognized. Yet through it all, his name endured. His story, once local and fragile, had transcended the boundaries of time and geography. By then, David Johnson was no longer remembered as a man alone. He had become more than history, more than legend. He had become archetype. His garage was no longer a single suburban structure in an ordinary neighborhood. It was a symbol carved into the human soul. People spoke of it not as a place, but as an idea, the threshold of dignity. In temples, mosques, churches, and sanctuaries across continents, preachers wove his name into sermons. In meditation halls, seekers whispered his lesson as mantra. In classrooms that floated high above oceans or spun in orbit around Earth, teachers projected holograms of the garage door creaking shut, and children closed their eyes to imagine what it must have felt like to stand where David once stood. Some called him Saint David of the Door. Others knew him as the guardian of boundaries. Entire philosophies bloomed from his story, interpreting the meaning of space, respect, and the unseen sanctity of human worth. Scholars debated, was it resistance? Was it justice? Was it love of self? And though their answers varied, the fact remained that humanity had agreed on one truth. David Johnson's choice mattered. Even language bore the imprint of his act. Across cultures, to close the door no longer referred only to wood and hinges, but to the moment when one reclaims dignity. A young worker standing up to a cruel employer would be told, "You close the door." A child refusing to accept bullying at school would be praised. David would be proud, "You shut the garage," words that once belonged only to an ordinary man's home had become universal. Yet as the centuries stretched on, something profound happened. People no longer argued about whether David was real. His existence was beyond dispute, documented in archives preserved for eternity. But his story had grown so large that his humanity blurred. Some whispered that perhaps he had been chosen by something greater, that his life was not random but destined. Others reminded them no. His power lay precisely in the fact that he had been ordinary. He had not sought greatness. He had only sought respect. And so, in the balance between myth and truth, David Johnson lived forever. On the 1000th anniversary of his act, a global gathering was held. Leaders, citizens, artists, and children all came together, not just in one place, but in thousands, connected through streams of light that bridged continents. They called it the closing. In the heart of the gathering stood a monument, not of marble or gold, but of simple steel shaped into a door. Its handle was worn smooth by generations of hands, each one closing it in symbolic unity. Around the world at the same moment, billions of people reenacted David's gesture, closing doors in their homes, schools, offices, and temples. The sound of doors shutting echoed like thunder across the planet, a chorus of dignity that spanned humanity. A young girl, standing beside her grandmother, asked softly, "Why do we still do this after all these years?" Her grandmother, her voice trembling with reverence, answered, "Because dignity never grows old. Because the moment he closed that door, he gave us all permission to protect ourselves. We honor him because his act belongs not just to the past, but to every moment we live." As the doors closed around the globe, silence fell. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of reverence, the kind that follows prayer or lingers after music. And in that silence, David Johnson's presence felt nearer than it had in 1,000 years. For though he had died long ago, his spirit had fused with the collective conscience of humanity. His courage was no longer his alone. It was everyone's. His story had become a scripture not bound by religion but by humanity itself. And as the silence lifted, voices rose in unison, reciting the words etched into every monument raised in his honor. Dignity is not given. Dignity is not borrowed. Dignity is claimed. The words echoed across valleys and mountains, across oceans and cities, carried by billions of tongues as though David himself spoke through them. In that moment, the story reached its final form. No longer was it about a man in a garage. It was about humanity itself, its struggle, its resilience, its unyielding insistence on worth. David Johnson had become eternal, not because he sought eternity, but because eternity recognized him. And so the legend closed like the door he once pulled shut. The world moved forward, generation upon generation, but his story remained indestructible. Every act of defiance against injustice, every whisper of pride in the face of humiliation, every quiet insistence on being seen, each was a spark lit from the flame he left behind. The garage door of David Johnson would never open again, for it no longer needed to. It stood forever in the soul of humanity. A threshold that once closed opened a new world that could never be taken back. And that was the end, yet also the beginning. Because every time someone somewhere claimed their dignity, David Johnson lived again.